welcome to The Age to Come. This is Biblical Doctrine for the Church in this age. I am Dave Wilson, here as always with Pernell Gibson and Josh Howard. And today we are doing something a little bit different than what we have done before. This is episode 28, and it's been a little bit since
with a 2-month hiatus or month and a half hiatus.
That hasn't been intentional. It just schedule's been crazy. But anyway, we're here and we're doing something a little bit different. We are interviewing actually one of my personal favorite authors. She hasn't been on this show before. I did get to interview her once before on I know some of you guys are familiar with Worldview Warriors. That's the webcast that I did before we started doing The Age to Come. So we'll maybe put a link in there to that. We're excited for this one.
Yeah, definitely. So Professor Nancy Pearcey is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity: How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and Total Truth. She is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She has been quoted in The New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity today, and hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Please welcome Professor Nancy Pearcey.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
All right. Well, I'm excited for this one. I know you've written a lot. You've taken up a lot of different topics in your writings, and the interview today is really going to focus on the new book that you have coming out, which is The Toxic War on Masculinity. I had the pleasure of getting to read through that book this week, and it was fascinating. So I guess if you could just kind of let us know, what inspired that book, and what are you hoping to accomplish in its writing?
Well, 2 things, the problem and the solution. The problem is that American culture has grown incredibly hostile to masculinity. And I was just blown away sometimes by how acceptable it's become to say negative things about masculinity. The Washington Post, for example, had an article titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" Wait. This sounds like some fringe feminist publication. It's the Washington Post.
Wow.
A Huffington Post editor said her New Year's resolution was kill all men. That you can buy T-shirts that say, "So many men, so little ammunition."
Wow.
And there are books out now with titles like, "I Hate Men," "No Good Men," "Are Men Necessary?" So I really wanted to find out, where is this coming from? Because, you cannot really effectively counter a social trend unless you know where it came from. And even some men are jumping on the bandwagon. You may have seen this, it was a couple of weeks ago, the director of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, said testosterone is a poison that we have to work out of our system.
Oh, wow.
And another male author said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. So this was what I wanted to, first of all, I wanted to say, where does this come from? Many people think, well, it's just, maybe from second wave feminism in the 1960s, but it actually goes much further back. And so my interest was to say, how can we recognize where it's coming from so that we can counter it more effectively? And then so that's the problem. And then the solution is, secondly, I was again blown away, but this time by something positive, which is the sociological data on Christian men is much more positive than most people realize. In fact, if you go online, you find that Christian men are often held up as, exhibit A of toxic masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, let me just read you a few of these quotes. They're very easy to find on the internet, but just to give you a flavor, conservative Protestant gender ideology can clearly lead to abuse, both physical and emotional. Another one in a Christian publication: it is no secret that abuse is prevalent in conservative churches that embrace headship theory. And a third quote: the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today.
Mm-hmm.
So what I found interesting is that psychologists and sociologists were looking at these accusations and saying, yeah, but where's the evidence? Where's your data? Well, it turns out they don't have any. They are overlooking the evidence from the social sciences. Sociologists went back and said, okay, let's do some studies. Let's find out what are Christian men like. And what they found was that evangelical family men meaning husbands and fathers, who attend church regularly are the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers. So compared to the average American family man, evangelical men are the most loving to their wives. And by the way, the wives were interviewed separately.
Nice. Nice.
And so what they're really reporting is that the wives said that they were the happiest in terms of the love and appreciation that they got from their husbands. Evangelical men were also the most engaged fathers, both in shared activities like church youth group or sports, and in terms of discipline, like setting limits on screen time or enforcing bedtime. Evangelical couples are the least likely to divorce, and the real stunner, they have the lowest rates of domestic violence of any group in America.
Wow.
Yeah, even Christians don't know this. I had to go digging in academic sociological journals to find this. And I thought, man, this needs to get out. This needs to get out to the churches. This needs to get out to Christians so that they can be encouraged in a culture that's very negative towards masculinity. Christian men need to be encouraged that in terms of empirical data, rigorous studies, they are testing out as the best. In fact, let me give you one quote on this too. So my favorite sociologist, he's done the largest study. His name is Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And he wrote an article in the New York Times in which he said, and this is a quote, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America," they're testing the wives in particular because male headship is said to be oppressive to women. So the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. So this was,
73%. That's not like amazing. A slim majority.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Right. I mean, I'm astonished that the New York Times published this.
Yeah, right.
Wow. Well,
so that's a thumbnail of the problem and the solution.
Okay.
I for one am massively encouraged because I thought this was calling for a toxic war on masculinity. So I'm massively encouraged. I'm sorry, that was my lame joke. No, this is no, Nancy. I like the way you're tapping into that because I'm thinking just from whenever I think of like our anecdotal or kind of our subjective experience of the way men are perceived or that it seems to be. And I know you've walked through a lot of this, as a professor. I've heard you talk about how you kind of use, reading groups and student groups kind of in your building of the book and that sort of thing. So I'm just thinking of like the circles in which we interact when you're going through something like premarital counseling or just normal pastoral interaction with people within the church or within the broader Christian community. You use terms like male leadership or male, pretty much anything where you're attaching male to any sort of what we might think of traditional masculine roles. And even within Christian circles, oftentimes there seems to be a hesitancy as if to talk about even like, let's just say something as in a male leading in whatever role, that automatically raises red flags. I think even for a lot of, we could say conservative Christian blocks. So I really, appreciate what you're saying on that. Oh,
yes, you're absolutely right. I have found, to my great surprise, that this is the most controversial book I've ever written.
Wow.
Following the book where you had huge sections on transgenderism and homosexuality.
Wow.
Exactly. That book, which is called Love Thy Body, I really thought that would be the most controversial. Mm-hmm. But in Christian circles, as you note, this has been more controversial. So you mentioned my classes. Yeah, I do a lot of reading groups and teach it in my classes, to kind of knock off the rough edges. Right. But what I found is, so my young female students, most of them identify as feminist, and they would get triggered if I said, anything positive about men, as if by doing so I was denigrating women.
Wow.
And meanwhile, my male students were equally defensive. When I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us."
Wow.
So, and if they told their friends, they would come back to my class or my reader group, and they'd talk to their friends or their family members about the book. And invariably, the first question was, "Whose side is she on?"
Wow.
With that sort of a tone, whose side is she on? Is she some raging feminist who's bashing men, or is she some reactionary, angry, defender of the status quo? So it has been amazing. I had to rewrite chapter 1 multiple times to try to get over that initial barrier, because once people got into the data, like that sociological data I just mentioned, when they got into the content of the book, they said, "Oh, this is interesting. I didn't know this." And they would like the book.
Right.
But I had to get over that initial barrier with almost everybody. It
Wow.
was amazing.
So when you use the word war in the title there, that's not just clickbait. You're not just trying to like make a splash, because what you're describing is people viewing very much battle lines having been drawn. Whose side is she on? Like what front in this war is she engaged in? That's fascinating.
Yeah, good point. Well, I wanted to have both the words toxic and masculinity, because that's the phrase. But I didn't want to use the phrase because I do not think masculinity is toxic. So I didn't even want to use the phrase. So I sort of did a play on words. Right? So it's the toxic war on masculinity. So people do sort of a double take, like, what? Wait, what?
Nice.
That's interesting. So I guess one of the questions that I have, and that I thought was interesting that you really fleshed out in the book, is just how did we get here? We do a lot with like early church history and stuff here, and it's interesting to me reading through a lot of the really around like the time of Augustine and sort of that late early church, and it seems like a lot of people at that time, and even like Greek philosophers and things like that, would tend to have a very low view of women. And they would see women as sort of troublesome and, very impious and promiscuous and things like that. And, it was almost like men were sort of like the ideal person as a man. And it seems like, with what you're describing now of where we are, it's like that's completely flipped. And, whereas back then it was just popular to bash women and stuff like that, now it's flipped and now men are there. So what were some of those key factors that sort of flipped the script there?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, it was thought that the insight into right and wrong is a rational insight, and they thought men were more rational, and therefore men are more moral. Men were thought to be morally stronger and more able to control their passions. And it didn't flip until the 19th century. And this is so amazing for so many of my readers. Say, what? They have no idea how recent it is. The idea that women are morally superior was totally new in the 19th century. No one had ever said that before. And it happened primarily because of the Industrial Revolution. We have to go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution to see how the secular script for masculinity began to develop. Before the Industrial Revolution, men worked with their families all day, right? On the family farm, the family industry, the family shop. And so the cultural expectations on men was much more oriented toward caregiving, right? Taking care of their family. They had to be gentle and understanding as they trained their children in adult skills and so on. In fact, the concept of authority was very specific back then. It didn't mean you get to do whatever you want. It meant you had responsibility for the common good, because we all look out for what's good for us. As individuals, I look out for what's good for me. You look out for what's good for you. But who's in charge of the common good, whether it's the marriage or the family or the church or the civil society? That's what authority was for. It's that person was not supposed to follow his own interest. The favorite word at the time was disinterested, meaning he didn't look out for his own interest. He looked out for the interest of the whole. So that concept of authority we've largely lost. So how did we lose that very biblical understanding of male authority? In the Industrial Revolution, it took work out of the home, right? and men had to follow work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, they were not working with people that they loved and had a moral bond with. They were working as individuals in competition with other men. And all of a sudden, it seemed like, well, to succeed in this industrialized workplace, they had to look out for number one. They had to be more aggressive, more competitive, more egocentric, and so on. And you see it already in the literature of the time. People began to protest that our men are changing. Their character is changing. They're losing that caretaking ethos that they had in the colonial era. And they're becoming egocentric. They're never home. They're losing that connection with their families. I'll just quote a letter to the editor in the newspaper at the time said, in gaining economic success, it said, the American man is losing his soul.
Wow.
So people really sensed it at the time. And that's where the rhetoric begins to change and begins to cast masculinity in a negative light, because masculinity was changing under the social pressure. And also society was secularizing. After the Industrial Revolution, there grew up a very large public realm, right? Business, industry, factories, banks, academia, the state. And people began to say that these large institutions should be run by scientific principles, by which they meant value-free, right? So you weren't supposed to bring your personal values into the public realm. And we still hear that today, right?
Oh, for sure. Yep.
And so as a result, men were going through a very much more secularized education, working in a secularized work environment, and they began to be more secular. The biblical concepts of morality began to lose their hold on men's hearts. And so this was another reason that women were held up as more moral, because men's character was seen to becoming more coarse, lewd, crude, and rude. Men's character was seen to be becoming more coarse. And they were, so who was going to take care of values? If you can't express your values in the public realm, then they're relegated to the private realm. And women were still in the home. So women were held up then as the moral guardians of society. And when their men came home at night, they were supposed to reform and refine them and remind them of spiritual and moral truths. And so that tension of, women seen as better and having a right to hold men in check starts all the way back in the 19th century. And we see it today. I talked to a young man in his mid-20s, a Christian, recently, and he said, "Oh, it's very much the same way." I'll tell you at least his perspective as a young Christian. He said, men are considered, much more liable to sin and vice, especially in the sexual realm. And women are supposed to draw the line and hold them in check and hold them morally responsible. So apparently it's still very much part of the Christian subculture today. Anyway, You are right. It started in the 19th century, and it is not intrinsic. It is not intrinsic to see men as more prone to sin and vice and women as good. That's all a heritage of the 19th century.
I think that seems to play into like so well with what we experience within Christian life and within church life. Is so often, I've heard from many pastors, and I think a lot of people are starting to write on this. Like, praise God, you're writing some things on this as well. Just thinking toward, why are men not leading the families? Why does the mother oftentimes become the spiritual de facto head of the home? Why is she the one pouring into the kids, and the husband has very little? I'm thinking of a book. Chris Wiley, or C.R. Wiley is his writing name. He just wrote on something kind of adjacent to this, not exactly, but adjacent to it. But looking at the story of the family, right? It seems, if I'm hearing you correctly, to tell the story of this toxic war on masculinity is almost to kind of tell the story of the family and what's occurred to it, maybe in our present age.
Yeah, good. If you'll notice, I wrote the foreword to that book.
Oh, there you go. Well, they see. So you agree with me. Very good. All right.
Yeah, I wrote the foreword to Chris Wiley's book. Today, for example, let's look at fatherhood. Today, we all know that fathers are ridiculed and mocked in the media. that he's always the butt of the joke, and the mom's always smarter. Where did that start? Where did that come from? We all know it's happening, but we don't know where it came from. Again, it's the Industrial Revolution. As men were taken out of the home, they lost touch with what was going on in their family. They lost touch with the close relationship they used to have with their sons, especially their sons. They were no longer attuned to the family dynamics. And already in the 19th century, you see it in the literature. They start saying, fathers are becoming irrelevant and incompetent as parents, since they're not in touch with what's going on in the home. They began to be portrayed as incompetent. And there are a lot of articles at the time saying, fatherhood has become a weekend thing. They're just not here enough to discipline and train their children the way that they used to. So again, the whole notion that men are incompetent parents starts with the Industrial Revolution. And not only that, but what happened to boys? By the way, I have another chapter in my book on boys. What happened to boys when men were out of the home all day?
Right.
It used to be they had day in, day out working with their fathers side by side on the family farm, the family industry. All of a sudden, they had a great deal of unstructured time.
Yeah.
And boys began going wild. The phrase boys will be boys, that wasn't around before that. People did not think of boys as being particularly rambunctious and rebellious and bad behaving. That was not a notion before. It happened when fathers were taken out of the home and boys did begin to go wild. The leading psychologist of the day said, never before has in American history has the boy been so wild, and never before has he been so half orphaned. I like that phrase. Half orphaned and left up to female guidance in the home, the school, and the church. Well, of course, if he's getting structure and moral direction from women, no wonder he thinks, well, to be moral is to be effeminate. And who wants to do that? So these boys were being raised with the notion that to be a real boy was to be wild, rambunctious, rebellious, rule breaking. And they brought that with them into adulthood. So that's another reason why the secular script for masculinity began to focus on these very negative traits that the boys were bringing with them from childhood.
Wow, that is fascinating.
That makes so much sense too. I don't remember which book or which author was arguing, but just he was basically making the claim that, well, part of the problem is we don't even know what masculinity is anymore. Just because you look at the statistics on homes without fathers and things like that, and it's like, okay, well, what is a little boy supposed to strive to be? What is he supposed to be, trying to reach after, trying to be like, if he doesn't have that male presence to know what masculinity is? He knows what femininity is. He probably has a decent view of that. So then, well, masculinity then just must be the opposite. So if femininity deals with things like nurturing and and values and things like that, okay, well then whatever the opposite of that is must be what I should try to pursue as a man.
Yep.
Yes. And there was the reaction in the late 19th century. There was a reaction to the idea that women were the moral gatekeepers of society, and men did begin to say, well, we need to be wild and we need to go out into nature. And not that there's anything wrong with nature, but their point was get away from civilization, get away from women, get away from family. That's how you find your authentic identity. So it really took hold, especially after Charles Darwin presented his theory of evolution, because that led to the idea that men are at heart, they're beasts within. The animal nature is their true nature, which was a huge reversal all the way back to the ancient Romans and Greeks. The idea was that your true self was the moral, spiritual will. And that they should be governing your animal appetites. And now that it was flipped, and under the influence of Darwinism, people began to say, no, your true nature is the inner barbarian, the savage, the wild beast, and civilization is just a thin veneer. That was a very common phrase at the time, a thin veneer of civilization.
Mm-hmm.
And so the person who actually popularized Darwinism in America was Herbert Spencer, and he wrote that the men who won out in the struggle for existence, so our ancestors, would be the men who were brutal, barbarian, even predatory, crude, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, that's our true nature. And to really be authentic men, that's what we get in touch with, and I think you're right, David. Part of that, it was, well, we have to be whatever women aren't. But Darwin gave them a scientific rationale as well. And the question then arises, well, how do women get along with such brutal men? And Spencer's answer was, well, it would be good if they developed the ability to please. And it would also help if they learned how to hide their resentment at such poor treatment.
Wow.
So the message of evolution, and Darwin, by the way, and added to that was that Darwin did explicitly say that women were inferior, that they're mentally and morally inferior to men. And he said, well, they're more sensitive, intuitive, but those are traits of the lower races. So, even women's strong points were seen as signs of her inferiority. So Darwinism played a big role in the development of a very toxic secular script for men.
Wow.
Contrary to the just what everybody thinks, that it's just the conservative religious men that are the ones just out there being chauvinistic and here's why we have all this. And wow.
I'll tell you what I was getting from just thinking through that. How does that play out in church life? Maybe instead of men's retreats where we eat bacon and go hunting together, just a bunch of men on a mountaintop, maybe bring the kids along and have a family retreat. I'm just throwing that out there. We don't have to make a law where there is no law, but it's worth considering. Lead your family well.
No, I agree with you. Actually, I spent a lot of time in the book having to counter that message and say, no, in the church, well, the biblical view of masculinity really starts with Genesis. And the cultural mandate. Not all churches teach the cultural mandate. It's Genesis. It's where God, he's created male and female in his image, and then he gives them the first job description: right? Be fruitful and multiply, and subdue the earth.
Right.
And be fruitful and multiply doesn't mean just family, but it also means all of the social institutions that historically do grow out of the family. Right. So the clan, the tribe, the school, the church, the government, the marketplace, all grows out originally of the family. So it means that God calls us to build all of the social institutions. And subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So it's not just, we think of, okay, be a farmer. No, it means, go into mine the minerals out of the earth. And it means build buildings and bridges and computers and compose music. And I had a student who once said, come on, compose music. I said, well, I play the violin. So I said, what is the violin made out of? Wood. What's the bow made out of? Horsehair. So all the transcendent beauty we associate with music starts with harnessing the raw materials of nature. And so I say this several times in the book, that men find their true authentic manhood by going back to the cultural mandate, which says, yes, you, instead of trying to go out into the wild and leave women's civilization behind, which was a strong theme in the late 19th century, no, you find your true masculine identity by rolling up your sleeves and digging into the cultural mandate, your family and productive work.
No, that's good.
That is really,
and that's also a huge relief for me, who spends a lot of time in books and has many people who actually build things with their hands in our congregation. Right. I'm super relieved to know I can still be fulfilling the cultural mandate through scholarship too. That's good. What'd you have there, Dave?
That's awesome. Yeah, that was I guess my next question is just what things can we do, sort of seeing, okay, here's where we are in society. What can we be doing specifically as the church to be pushing in that good direction? Because, one of the things that I've been, I guess, thinking of, and I don't think you really touched on this in your book, but okay, so we have sort of the masculine presence really kind of being evacuated from the home. in the 18th and 19th, or I guess, 19th century, especially. But then you have, in the wake of sort of the second wave feminism in the 1960s and onward, it's like we almost see now the feminine presence is almost to a large degree being removed from the home as well. And what does that leave us with? When you look at how things are going in terms of like, the government's pushing, more and more education, get your kids in preschool earlier, longer school days, year-round school. It's like, it's almost like, okay, the masculine presence has been removed, and now
kind of a fragmentation.
Yeah, exactly. Now the feminine presence is, halfway gone now too. So then where does that leave us in pushing forward?
That's a good question.
Right. You can't write a book on like this without some solutions. And so I do have a whole chapter on practical solutions. And you're right. I mean, if the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home, it wasn't just men's work. It was also women's work.
Right.
Because women were very involved in household manufacture as well.
Sure.
You're making candles and canning food and weaving and sewing, all your clothing from scratch. So women's economic productivity was also removed from the home. And that is, by the way, a major reason for the feminist movement, because you might say the cultural mandate was split in half. Women got be fruitful and multiply, and men got subdue the earth. And neither one of them is really happy being only half a person. And so, I mean, people were surprised at this, but I found surveys where men report just as much family work conflict as women did. I mean, I had my students say, no way. But it's because men often don't express it as much because it's not considered as acceptable. But anyway, I do have a whole chapter on ways in which both men and women can bring some of their work home. And the pandemic was a real game changer because a lot of people found out, hey, they can do more work at home than they realized. And 65% of men in one survey said they don't want to go back to full-time being in the office. They've gotten closer to their family and they love it. As the New York Times put it, I love this title. They wrote an article with a title, during the pandemic, I think they said fathers got closer to their children and they don't want to lose that.
Wow.
Wow. So I do have a lot on, it's more anecdotal because there's no general principles, but I interviewed lots and lots of people who'd found ways to work maybe 2 days a week from home, right? Or who have found ways to shave off some time to go be a coach for their son's soccer and baseball team. Or even sometimes come home completely as a consultant or starting a home-based business. And women too, frankly, I know almost no women who don't have at least some part-time work at home. Almost every woman these days finds some way to make money from home because we economically we have to. So I'll give you just one example because it's nice to have a concrete example. One of my students' husbands was an IT professional in Southern California, and he came home during the pandemic. And because he was home, he was much more involved in their family's homeschooling. He decided he would be the one to make lunch every day. He could take his kids to soccer practice, and his wife was freed up enough that she started a part-time business. She's an opera singer. I had a student who was an opera singer.
Wow.
So she started a voice studio, and the whole family benefited from the additional income. So I interviewed the husband, and he said, our family is so much better balanced now. I am never going back to a cubicle. And then the final kicker was, he said, the time that I used to spend commuting, I now spend praying with my wife every morning.
Wow.
So anecdotes like that can help people think through, is there a way for me to sort of push back? And millennials, especially in surveys, millennials say, I want more of a balance. I want to share breadwinning and caretaking, more evenly between husbands and wives. So they're trying to make those demands on the workplace. It's going to take some time, but I wanted to encourage people that it can be done. And there are people out there doing it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's really encouraging too. I know it can, looking at sort of the cultural landscape that we find ourselves in, there's a lot of discouraging things that we find there, but I think those are some really helpful and encouraging.
And especially one of those silver linings. We've talked about those before. The silver linings that came out of the last 3 years, lots of things to look, at the storm clouds, obviously, but a lot of silver linings and a lot of people rediscovering family and how they might serve God in their family and in their home.
Like how many people are now homeschooling that never even considered it before? Because,
friends before.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, some of us were homeschoolers before it was cool back in the 80s when it was very odd. But yeah, anyway, we won't go there. Topic for another day.
That's right. Cool. I think that that kind of sums up the main things we had for you there. But is there anything in particular that you would want to leave us with, or anything that you didn't get to?
I would add to, Nancy, if you could just like who is this book? You've kind of walked through it, but like, who is this written for? Like, if somebody's listening to this and they think, oh, would this help me? Like, who's kind of like the target you guys are kind of trying to serve with this book?
Wow. All of my books, of course, are written for a fairly general audience. They're accessible, they're not scholarly, they're full of anecdotes, especially now that I've been teaching at the university. You've probably noticed if you've read my earlier books like Love Thy Body, they're full of anecdotes about my students. Especially, I have lots of good anecdotes from my student said this and my student did this, so they're full of stories. And I think I started out just wanting to equip Christians to answer these very hostile attacks on masculinity and build up men. And there is one thing we didn't cover, and that is, why is it that Christians don't know how well Christian men are doing? And it's because the statistics are skewed. We've all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture.
Okay, right? Yep.
In my research, I discovered that that's one of the most widely cited statistics by Christian leaders. It turns out it's false. And the reason that they got it wrong was, so the sociologists went back to the data and they divided out evangelical men into two groups. The ones that are truly committed, authentic, attend church regularly and so on. And they're the ones who test out better than secular men. But then there are, in America especially, there are a fair number of nominal Christians, cultural Christians, people who in a survey like that might check the Baptist box, but who actually don't attend church very often, if at all. And these men test out shockingly different. Their wives test out as being the unhappiest in their marriage. They are the least engaged with their kids. They have the highest rates of divorce, higher than secular men. And then the real shocker is they have the highest rates of domestic violence, higher than secular men.
Oh, wow.
Just sort of this extrinsically religious group.
Wow, that's shocking though. Yeah.
Isn't it? And apparently people say, well, why is that? And so apparently it's that they pick up language like headship and submission because they hang around the fringes of the Christian church. And so that seems to give them permission to be even worse than secular men. They feel they infuse secular meanings like dominance and entitlement and I get my own way. Instead of getting the biblical meaning of those terms, they infuse them with meanings from the secular script. And so if you put these two groups together, which a lot of studies do, right. A lot of studies will just do, okay, evangelicals, and they put them together. Well, obviously the statistics, the stats are going to be quite skewed and quite misleading. And so that's an important thing, I think, for Christians and for churches to be aware of, that the men who are there every Sunday are doing far better than anyone realizes, far better than the secular media is acknowledging.
Right.
But the perceptions are skewed because there are so many nominals out there who are, in fact, worse than secular men. So that helps us make sense of, I forget who now. One of you was saying, what we pick up from the secular media is that Christians are the worst. Well, that's why. Now we know why.
Yeah, because they're using the language and the identification of Christendom, and yet they're practicing it in such a way that's even worse than the unbelieving world around. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, goodness.
That does. So yeah, it's like if there's a group where you could rightly apply the term toxic masculinity, it would be
maybe there, right?
There in that just extrinsically
Right.
Christian, quote unquote,
Right.
group. Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
and I think it also tells you something about the church's responsibility. These are guys who are out there, like you said, identifying as evangelicals.
Yeah.
And so what is the church's responsibility in terms of reaching out to them? And it also, if it helps us polemically as well, because it's not the Christianity that's making them toxic. It's the secular. It's infusing secular definitions into the terms. I was very careful. I was very careful because you even find Christian books, as you know, saying that evangelical men are overbearing, patriarchs, tyrannical, etc. It's not the Christianity that's making them that way. It's the secular definitions that they're bringing in to the Christian terms. So I'm very careful to blame secularism as opposed to blaming Christianity, and I think that's important.
No kidding. Yeah, putting the blame where it's due. That's good. No, that's really good. And that seems like this seems like a super timely book in a lot of ways, just because. I mean, social media is usually not a good barometer, but sometimes it's helpful. And it seems that these conversations are swirling quite a bit more forcefully recently, specifically within Christian circles. People are trying to figure out, complementarianism, patriarchy or patriarchalism. There's sort of a resurgence of that. I think this will be a great help, I think, in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can tell you, I'm very excited about this book. And I know I haven't said a lot. I've just been taking in a lot of what you've been saying, because like the data in and of itself, like in a lot of the experiences that you talk about, like I experience that on a regular basis, in the workplace, having to contend with that particular type of ideology. So,
and the perception of being a toxic masculine presence and all that, I'm sure. Yeah.
And I work in higher education. So this is you see this type of stuff a lot. But yeah, so I'm really looking forward to just the data and being able to, in my conversations, bring up some of that.
Yeah, good.
Just to give an extra plug for just Nancy Pearcey's work in general, but that's one of the things that I really love about her books, especially her last couple books, is they are very easy to read. It's very easy to pick up. But everything is cited in there. So anytime that she's referring to a specific study, you can go flip to the back of the book and pull up exactly where that is. So, just for those conversations, it's not just anecdotal stuff that she's got. It's backed up by sociology.
Wait, are we talking footnoted or endnoted? I don't mean to bring up controversy toward the end here, but are we talking footnoted or that's probably a publisher's call. Never mind. We'll leave that one for another day.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again so much for your time.
Absolutely.
This has been fascinating. I think, for anybody watching this video, definitely check out this book. And where can people find out more about you, Professor Pearcey?
I do have a website, which is nancypearcey.com. And so you can see my other books. You can order The Toxic War. Hey, I'll show it. I'll hold it up. You can order The Toxic War on Masculinity. You can pre-order it now. It's available already. And pre-orders always help the algorithms in case you pre-order it. But obviously you can get it on Amazon, christianbook.com, or from the publisher. The publisher has a special 40% off, for pre-orders.
Oh, fantastic.
So yeah, you can get it anywhere you prefer to buy your books.
And the publisher's Baker, is that correct?
Baker.
Okay, yes. Perfect. Okay.
Awesome.
Yep.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again. This has been fantastic. And as always, thank you guys for watching and listening to us.
And we'll be joining them again in a month or 2 weeks or who knows.
Hopefully less
3 days.
Right. Yeah.
You never know.
Exactly. But again, thank you guys for watching. Definitely check this book out. Check out really all of Professor Pearcey's stuff. I know we're actually going to be doing Love Thy Body in a small group here later this summer.
That's right. That's
right. Fantastic book of hers.
That's right.
There we go.
As long as you mention it.
There we go.
Nice.
So people have a visual image of it.
There we go.
Perfect.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys again. Like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And we will catch you guys on the next one. Grace and peace.